All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. I know what you're thinking. Enough of this guy already. I've seen him 4 times this week. Well, we've got a new concept for you today. Welcome, everybody, to the Lab Report. The Lab Report is brought to you by Mr. Cannabis Law. I am your host, Todd Rosales. And actually, with me today, I have the founder of Mr. Cannabis Law himself, attorney Dustin Robinson. We'll be getting to Dustin in just a second. So, for those of you tuning in for the first time, let's give you a little idea of what the Lab Report is. Listen, there's a ton of places that you can get your information in the cannabis space, but it's just that. There are a ton of places. It can be another full-time job in itself. And with the industry changing so much, if you're not skating to where the puck is going, you're going to be lost. Join us every Friday at 12:30 p.m. as Dustin and I break down the biggest headlines in the industry, so this way you can get what you need and get back to your day. All right, let's get to it. But before we get to it, let me bring in my co-host who's in it with me for the long haul, Mr. Cannabis Law himself, Dustin Robinson. Dustin, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about your background and why you're going to be the smart guy in the show going forward?
Thank you very much for having me. I couldn't have a better co-host than you. You've done an awesome job with Elevate Your Grind, and it's an honor to be sharing this show with you. My background, I'm the founding partner of Mr. Cannabis Law. It's a full-service law firm that's exclusively focused on the cannabis and psychedelic space. I have, in addition to having my law license, I am also a licensed CPA and a licensed realtor. After I got my master's of accounting, I worked at Deloitte for a bit. Then after law school, I worked at Holland & Knight for several years. Then I went in-house running a multi-state manufacturing company. I sold my interest in that company a couple years ago, at which time I essentially started my my law firm, Mr. Cannabis Law, and it has been quite a journey ever since. And that's the background.
Awesome. And I couldn't have picked a better co-host for the show. And as we go through today's top headlines, folks, you'll see why. This is going to be a great show. Our goal is to break down the top news in about 15 minutes for you. So with that, let's get into the headlines. First up on our plate, Dustin, most states are starting to permit marijuana retailers to sell hemp-derived CBD, creating competition for the actual marijuana companies themselves. Now, some people will see this as competition if dispensaries are also selling hemp products, but to me, I think having CBD in these stores will actually put those products in front of more consumers they may not elsewise see. What are your thoughts on this?
So this is absolutely huge news, and this is something everyone should be watching very closely. So what's happening here is some of these states are allowing the hemp industry to transact with the marijuana industry. Now, in most states, this isn't allowed. For example, Florida would not allow this to happen. So if you're a hemp company, you're not able to sell to a marijuana company, whether it's flower, isolate, finished product, anything like that. It's a challenge. And part of the challenge that some of these regulators are starting to find that are trying to allow this transacting is that the marijuana landscape requires a seed to sale tracking system, whereas the hemp space does not have a seed to sale tracking system. So one of the challenges is for these regulators is to allow this hemp to be brought into the marijuana supply chain and get it into that tracking system. So Colorado has come up with a pretty reasonable way of doing that. Illinois has an interesting law. It's actually some guidance that they put out. They don't actually really address the track and trace issue. But what both of these states are allowing now is for the hemp industry to transact with the marijuana industry. Now, obviously, the hemp industry loves this. The CBD oil market has just been plunging. There's a huge supply, not enough demand. This will provide another channel for the CBD suppliers to sell into. Now, the marijuana companies, I think, are probably going to be adverse to this at first because the marijuana companies are very territorial. They want to own the entire vertical. They want to own the entire horizontal. They don't want anyone to mess with them, right? But what we see here in Florida is that whole vertical model, it becomes very challenging because when you do everything, you can't be good at one thing. So there's a real lack of innovation here in Florida because of our vertically integrated structure. So even though I see marijuana companies being adverse to this at first, I think the marijuana companies that are able to adapt and strategize around this will find that it actually will supplement the industry quite well. Now, the article that was written about this is really good, but I want people to think a little bit deeper into this. I have a client right now that has a patent pending on some unique and novel technology that converts CBD isolate to THC Delta 9. Now, in states like Florida, you really can't use that technology because the marijuana companies can't buy CBD isolate from outside their supply chain. But in states like Colorado and Illinois now, that type of technology can now be deployed within the marijuana supply chain. So what does that do? That brings down the cost to the consumer tremendously, right? Because CBD isolate is much cheaper to purchase for a marijuana company than for them to grow their own marijuana, do the extraction process, and then have to derive CBD from that marijuana plant. So it will drive down costs. Number two, what it's going to do is it's going to increase the supply. Right now, there's an abundance of CBD oil. And if you think of a state like Illinois, they have a really big supply problem right now. The demand is through the roof since they launched recreational, and they don't have enough supply. So allowing this CBD oil to be put into the marijuana supply chain and then be converted into Delta 9 will help with that supply issue. And then number three, what it'll do is it'll obviously, like I said, give another channel for the CBD oil suppliers to sell into. So I think this is a great thing for the industry. I think as these lines become more blurred with marijuana and hemp, I think you're going to start to see federal regulators say, what the hell are we doing with this arbitrary 0.3%? And when those lines get blurred, I think it could potentially lead to federal legalization, or at least be one of the impetus to lead to federal legalization.
I agree with you. I think it's going to be a good thing for the marijuana industry in general, and it's leading us towards free market. So I'm very happy to see that, and thank you for your insight there. I'm going to have to stop thanking you for every insight because we're going to do that after every article. Moving on. In Loansharking news, the cannabis company Acreage Holdings borrows $15 million at a 60% interest rate from an unnamed institutional investor. He's probably unnamed because I'm pretty confident they found him in a back alley in Atlantic City at those interest rates. But Dustin, why would they borrow that much money at that interest rate instead of just pulling a FedEx and going straight to the casino and putting everything on red?
Yeah, well, it's really not a surprise. Acreage, their cash flow has been struggling for quite some time, as well as many of the other MSOs, and we'll get into that a little bit later in this segment. But Acreage has been struggling. They have had a lot of challenges, and essentially what this shows is this is a desperation. This is a lifeline for them. So they are really struggling from a cash flow perspective, and this injects some additional capital. And when you're desperate like this, there will be people like loan sharks, just like you said, that are willing to give you this capital, but give you a super high interest rate. I think there's also a $6 million penalty if they default. And of course, they have collateral with some of their assets that have quite significant value potentially. So, it's not a great deal. And then just yesterday, they announced something else where Canopy and Acreage entered into a new agreement to amend their April 2019 agreement that they previously signed, that will give more money from Canopy to Acreage. So these are two lifelines, but I'll tell you, I don't think they're going to be enough. I think we're going to see over the next couple months Acreage selling off more of their assets to bring more cash in. I think they'll probably sell off their most prized asset, which is the Florida license. I think we'll see that probably in the next couple months. They bought their Florida license for $67 million back in January 2019. And since then, they're barely even producing any product. So they've literally sat on this asset and they have not utilized this asset as they should be. And so they're likely going to sell that license, if I could guess it. And it will probably be at a price that's about probably even less than half of what they paid for it. I probably would imagine, licenses in Florida were trading at 1.67 million, 60 million, 45. I'm starting to see them at 35 million, and now I'm starting to even see some deal flow that's getting as low as in between 25 to 30 million dollars. So, Acreage, I think, is going to continue to be in trouble, and we're probably going to see them continue to try to sell off some assets to bring in some additional cash.
Not something you want to see from one of the early leaders in this space, but let that to be a lesson to some of the other companies out there. Hopefully they can learn from this. While we're on the subject of people that are in debt not paying it, there's a company that isn't. Ianthus received a demand letter for debt repayment after they defaulted in April. They also announced that they're most likely going to default again at the end of this month. What does this mean for them? Is this 2 or 3 months they've defaulted? They're not paying their debt. What's the future of Ianthus here?
Well, this is a trend we're continuing to see. So like Acreage, Ianthus also has a Florida license. And really, I lump these Florida licensees into three categories. The first category is Trulieve. Trulieve is absolutely crushing it. They own over 50% of the market. They had tremendous earnings in Q1. They're doing a great job, and they had a completely different approach. The second category I put them in is the 8 one-pointers that just got their licenses not too long ago that aren't really operational, and they're kind of paralyzed trying to figure out, do I try to sell this license and make, sell it for $30 million? Or do I try to operate this thing and spend about 10 to 15 million in operations and competing with companies like Trulieve? So you have Trulieve, you got the one pointers, and then the third category you have here in Florida is basically these MSOs that are just gasping for air. They are all competing just to stay alive. You got Ianthus, you have MedMen, we just talked about Acreage, Columbia Care Consortium. All these MSOs that are here in Florida, they are struggling just to stay alive. It's ugly out there. Now, there are some exceptions to those three categories. There's companies like One Plant that don't exactly fall nicely into those categories, but for the most part, that's kind of the dynamic we have here in Florida. These MSOs acquired as many assets as they can when money was available in 2018, 2019, and now the money is dried up and they just don't have the capital to even operate these licenses that they've acquired. So it's very, very challenging times for the market. But you're just seeing some corrections there. I think the stock market was way inflated, and now things are coming back to life.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what will happen here in Florida. We've always been a different kind of market, but it's crazy out there. Next topic. This is one that's probably pretty topical and gets a little political here, and something that I'm curious to learn more about. So I'm glad we're talking about it today. The Attorney General was accused of wasting the Department of Justice's resources to investigate marijuana mergers due to his personal bias. Now, the Department of Justice released a memo saying the investigations were appropriate. So for the general news cycle, obviously this is a topic because the Attorney General using DOJ resources as a waste of time because of his bias is terrible. But as far as for the cannabis industry, what does this mean for us, and do we need to care about it?
This is just a reminder of the enormous challenges that marijuana companies face. As we discussed, the MSOs, they're struggling from a cash flow perspective. And a lot of people will say, hey, that's from mismanagement. And they'd be partially correct. But also, I think they just grossly underestimated how costly it is to operate in this type of industry with the compliance costs and also with the cost of 280E, that tax provision. It's extremely hard for these companies to generate positive cash flow. So then when I hear news like this about these types of investigations, it gives me heartburn just thinking about all the legal costs, the unnecessary legal costs that these marijuana companies had to pay. And one of the companies I was MedMen. They were required to produce thousands of documents, and now you look at MedMen's situation and they're losing tremendous amounts of money. Obviously, like I said, I think that's also due to mismanagement, but obviously this compounds the issue when you're already struggling to make any positive cash flow, and then you got to spend all these legal fees on responding to these crazy requests from the DOJ and the antitrust division. It's very unfortunate. Of course, the DOJ is claiming that they had to do this because this is a new industry and because of the complexities due to the federal and state conflict in the law. They claim they had to do this, but that sounds to me like a pretext. So we'll see as the investigation goes on and more facts come out. I think it will be very interesting to see how this thing is really viewed when all the facts come out from the investigation.
No, I appreciate that because I literally knew nothing about it and purposely added into this show so you can educate me. But I'm glad everybody else benefit from that as well. And for our last headline we'll be covering today, there is no one better to answer this question than our own Mr. Cannabis Law himself, who just so happens, if you heard his bio, is also Mr. Psychedelic Law. And at the rate that he keeps adding these practices because he's so damn good at what he does, eventually we're just going to end up calling him Mr. Law. But a federal commission was tasked with developing recommendations to improve mental health treatment for military veterans, says that Congress and the executive branch need to start promoting research into the therapeutic uses of cannabis and psychedelics, such as psilocybin mushrooms and MDMA. I think this is a long time coming. Can you give us some insight into this a little bit further, given your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Quite honestly, I didn't know much about the mental health industry until I got involved in cannabis and really started talking to some of the doctors I represent in the cannabis industry. And they educated me tremendously on PTSD, depression, addiction. And, you know, right now, there's no doubt we're in a mental health crisis, especially after this pandemic. And what I've done is I have a couple projects ongoing that I hope to try to help with these mental health issues. One is, like you mentioned, my nonprofit, Mr. Psychedelic Law, which is focused on the legal reforms surrounding psilocybin mushrooms in Florida. The second one is we just started a not-for-profit called Mind Army, which is more focused on federal legalization of these substances. But also, what I do a lot of is I work with a non-for-profit called Ketamine Fund, and what the Ketamine Fund is it gets ketamine treatment for veterans that cannot afford it. And ketamine is kind of lumped in with psychedelics because of its dissociative effects. But ketamine is actually a Schedule III drug, whereas marijuana and psilocybin is Schedule I drugs. So ketamine is a legal off-label prescription drug, and historically it was used as an anesthetic, but now they're finding tremendous results from depression, PTSD, addiction, stuff like that. In fact, one of my clients just recently, they did a documentary with Lamar Odom where they took him out and cured his addiction through the use of ketamine and ibogaine. And Lamar Odom actually came back from that and ended up playing professional ball in Europe at the age of like 40. So we've seen tremendous results with a lot of different people. There's a lot of great research going on. MAPS is really close. They've been doing clinical trials under the FDA, and they've been doing clinical trials related to MDMA. And I think MDMA will probably be the first drug to make it through these clinical trials. But then you also have Compass Pathway that's doing tremendous work. You have USONA that's actually doing research on psilocybin's effect on depression. That's happening right here in Fort Lauderdale. In fact, someone on my, Scott Fisher, who's on my board of directors for Mr. Psychedelic Law, is a psychiatrist, and he's actually helping with some of that research being done in Fort Lauderdale related to psilocybin and depression. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff. Very happy to see that now the federal government is starting to acknowledge that there may be some there might be some medical benefits, which, you know, if it's a Schedule I substance, that basically means that there's no medical benefit, which we all know is absurd for marijuana, and we're starting to learn is also absurd for psilocybin and some of these other psychedelic substances. So it's exciting that the federal government's starting to acknowledge that. And in other news, they just recently mentioned that the military is going to be funding $27 million to research psychedelic drugs as well. So a lot of money is being pushed into this industry right now. A lot of research is being done, but I'll tell you, what needs to happen is these substances need to be rescheduled and out of Schedule I, because when they're Schedule I, they just make the research so difficult. And you know, I'm an advocate for the industry, but I'm all about responsible reform. And really, you can't have responsible reform if you can't do the research that's necessary on these substances. So that's really what's happening here is we're trying to loosen it up, get it rescheduled, and allow some more research so we could help we could help cure the mental health crisis that we have here today.
Well, thank you very much, Dustin. We ran through all 5 topics, and your insight was incredible. Folks, this has been your first episode of the Lab Report. Again, we're going to do this every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. This has been today's headlines, and this has been the Lab Report. We'll see you next week.